200,000 Persians died in one day. 10,000 Spartans killed them. That is not Greek legend inflated by Herodotus. That is the documented mathematical reality of what happened on August 27th, 479 BCE, when Pausanias led 10,000 Spartan warriors against 300,000 Persian troops at Plataea and achieved a casualty ratio that military historians still consider impossible. By sunset, the largest imperial army ever assembled in Europe lay scattered across 3 miles of limestone ground, their invincible general dead from a Spartan spear through his eye socket, their confidence as world conquerors shattered forever by Greek farmers fighting with bronze. This is the story of how apparent chaos became perfect tactical trap, how Spartan discipline proved more lethal than Persian numbers, and how the battle that saved Western civilization began with a withdrawal that looked like panic until it became the deadliest ambush in ancient history. But before we talk about the day that stopped Persian expansion forever, you need to understand the nightmare scenario facing Greece in summer 479 BCE. August 15th, 479 BCE. The acrid smoke rising from Athens' smoldering ruins could be seen from 30 miles away, a black pillar marking the spot where Western civilization teetered on the edge of extinction. From the sacred Acropolis, where marble columns lay shattered like broken bones, to the Agora, where democracy had been born, everything that represented Greek culture had been reduced to ash and rubble by Mardonius and his Persian army. Standing on the slopes of Mount Cithaeron, 10,000 Spartan warriors gazed down at the Boeotian plain where 300,000 Persian troops had established the largest military camp in human history. The mathematics were beyond hopeless. 30-to-1 odds against an empire that had conquered from India to Egypt, commanded by generals who had never known defeat. Picture this impossible scene as both armies prepared for what everyone knew would be Greece's final battle. Mardonius had established his base camp near Thebes, a fortress of pavilions stretching 5 miles in each direction, housing not just Persian troops, but contingents from across the known world. Scythian horse archers from the steppes, Bactrian heavy cavalry from Afghanistan, immortals from Persia proper, and Greek allies who had submitted to Persian rule rather than face annihilation. The daily consumption of this oceanic force equaled the annual production of grain from entire provinces. When they marched in formation, the dust clouds were visible from the islands of the Aegean Sea. Against this avalanche of imperial might, Pausanias had assembled what appeared to be a suicide mission masquerading as military strategy. The young Spartan regent, nephew of Leonidas, who had died at Thermopylae, commanded not just his 10,000 Spartans, but a coalition that defied every assumption about Greek political unity. Athens, which had feuded with Sparta for generations, now stood as their closest ally. 31 city-states had sent contingents totaling 100,000 men, but this apparent numerical strength concealed fatal weaknesses. Half were lightly armed militia from minor cities. Many had never fought alongside each other. Some harbored ancient grudges that made cooperation nearly impossible. But here is what Persian intelligence reports failed to grasp about the psychological transformation that had swept through Greece. The burning of Athens had accomplished something that decades of diplomacy never could. It had united Greeks in existential fury. When Mardonius's cavalry torched the Parthenon's wooden scaffolding and toppled statues that had stood for centuries, they had committed an act of cultural vandalism that transcended political differences. Spartans who had traditionally viewed Athenians as soft democrats now saw them as fellow victims of Persian barbarism. Athenians who had mocked Spartan militarism now understood that only Spartan discipline could preserve Greek freedom. Mardonius himself embodied the overconfidence that had infected Persian leadership after their string of victories. The general who had conquered Thrace and Macedonia, who had received the submission of half the Greek world through terror and bribery, viewed the approaching battle as a mere administrative task. His strategic calculation was brutally simple: destroy the remaining Greek army in one decisive engagement and resistance, would collapse completely. The Persian Empire would extend to the Atlantic, making the Mediterranean a Persian lake. Yet, the Persian general had made a crucial miscalculation about the nature of his enemy. These were not professional soldiers fighting for pay, or conquered peoples fighting under compulsion. These were free citizens defending their homes, their families, and their way of life against an empire that promised nothing but slavery and cultural extinction. More importantly, they were led by Spartans, whose military training began at age 7 and continued until death. Warriors who had spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this kind of desperate last stand. The strategic situation appeared hopeless to any rational observer. Persian cavalry controlled every approach to the Greek position. Their archers outnumbered the entire Greek force. Their logistics network could sustain siege warfare indefinitely, while the Greeks operated far from their supply bases. Every military manual written since the time of Cyrus would have predicted Greek annihilation within days. As Mardonius surveyed the Greek camp from his command pavilion, he saw exactly what he expected. A desperate rabble of citizen soldiers whose courage would crumble the moment they faced the disciplined might of imperial Persia. What he could not see was that these Greeks had spent the year since Thermopylae learning to fight not as individual city-states, but as a unified force. They had transformed defeat into education, humiliation into motivation, and desperation into the kind of focused fury that could shatter empires. The question was not whether Greece would survive. The question was whether the Persian Empire understood what it meant to face free men fighting for everything they held sacred. The Greek army took position along the Asopus River on August 20th, establishing what appeared to be a formidable defensive line across the foothills of Mount Cithaeron. Pausanias deployed his forces with the precision that had made Spartan military engineering legendary. 10,000 Spartans in perioikoi, anchoring the crucial right wing, 8,000 Athenians holding the left, and 82,000 allied troops stretched across the 2-mile center. The position offered natural advantages, the river protecting their front, the mountains securing their rear, and elevated ground providing clear fields of fire for their archers. Yet, within hours, these apparent strengths would reveal themselves as fatal weaknesses against Persian tactical superiority. Mardonius struck first with surgical precision, unleashing 50,000 cavalry across the Boeotian plain in a display of mounted warfare that stunned the Greeks with its coordinated violence. These were not ordinary horsemen. Scythian mounted archers could loose 12 arrows per minute at full gallop, maintaining accuracy at ranges where Greek weapons could not respond. Bactrian heavy cavalry rode horses, bred for size and endurance, each animal worth more than a Greek farmer's annual income. Persian cataphracts wore scale armor that had been perfected through centuries of steppe warfare, while their horses bore bronze chamfrons that turned their heads into battering rams. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Greek hoplites trained for close-quarters phalanx combat found themselves helpless against enemies who struck from 200 yards away and vanished before retaliation was possible. Arrows fell like deadly rain, forcing the entire Greek line to shelter behind shields, while Persian cavalry wheeled and charged with impunity. The mathematical precision was terrifying. 600,000 arrows launched per hour by disciplined horse archers who had learned their craft conquering the steppes of Central Asia. By the third day, Mardonius had escalated to economic warfare designed to strangle Greek resistance without risking his elite forces in direct assault. Persian cavalry systematically severed every supply line leading to the Greek position, intercepting food convoys and capturing messengers with surgical efficiency. Worse, they poisoned the spring of Gargaphia, the only reliable water source within the Greek defensive perimeter. What had seemed like an impregnable position became a death trap where 100,000 men faced slow starvation under the merciless August sun. Here is where ancient logistics reveals the brutal mathematics of survival. Each Greek warrior required 3 pounds of grain and 2 gallons of water daily just to maintain fighting effectiveness. Without Gargaphia, The nearest water source lay 5 miles away, across open ground swept by Persian cavalry. Supply convoys faced a gauntlet of mounted archers who could strike from all directions before melting back into the vast spaces of the Boeotian plain. The Greeks were learning the lesson that would define military strategy for millennia. Terrain advantages mean nothing without secure communications. The coalition's stress became visible as early as the 5th day. Contingents from minor city-states who had joined the alliance more from fear than conviction began sending secret envoys to Mardonius, offering submission in exchange for favorable terms. Persian gold had corrupted Greek resolve before. At Thermopylae, Thebans had switched sides rather than face annihilation. Now whispers spread through the allied camp about Persian mercy for those wise enough to abandon a hopeless cause. Modern military analysts recognize Mardonius's strategy as a masterpiece of psychological warfare combined with tactical patience. Rather than suffering casualties in frontal assaults, he was systematically destroying Greek morale through demonstration of Persian superiority. Each day that passed without effective Greek response proved that Persian cavalry controlled the battlefield absolutely. Each empty water barrel drove home the message that resistance meant death by thirst and starvation. But then everything began to accelerate toward crisis. On August 26th, Persian cavalry achieved what Mardonius had planned from the beginning. They severed the last Greek supply line from Mount Kithaeron, leaving Pausanias commanding an army that faced complete logistical collapse within 48 hours. The Spartan regent called an emergency council of war where the mathematical reality was undeniable: stay and die of thirst, or attempt a withdrawal that would expose 100,000 men to cavalry slaughter during daylight movement. What happened next would either validate Spartan tactical genius or provide Mardonius with the decisive victory that would complete Persia's conquest of Europe. As Greek signal fires blazed from the mountain peaks that night, both armies understood that the careful positioning and patient maneuvering had reached its logical conclusion. The morning would bring either salvation through impossible tactical innovation or annihilation that would end Greek civilization forever. The cruel mathematics had reached their inevitable conclusion. Mardonius had achieved everything Persian strategy demanded: a desperate enemy, superior position, and tactical initiative that guaranteed victory through simple attrition. All that remained was choosing the method of Greek destruction. The Persian general who had conquered Thrace and humbled Athens prepared to add Sparta to his list of vanquished enemies, never imagining that desperation could transform apparent weakness into the deadliest trap in military history. The order came at midnight on August 27th, whispered through the Greek lines with the urgency of men who understood that dawn would bring either salvation or annihilation: general withdrawal toward Plataea. Pausanias had made the calculation that would either mark him as a tactical genius or the fool who destroyed the last Greek army through reckless desperation. 100,000 men would attempt a coordinated night movement across broken terrain, while 50,000 Persian cavalry waited for exactly such an opportunity to transform orderly retreat into massacre. The complexity of moving such a force under cover of darkness defied human comprehension. Signal fires had to be extinguished without alerting Persian sentries. Equipment needed muffling to prevent the clash of bronze that could be heard for miles in the still night air. Most critically, each contingent had to maintain formation while navigating by starlight across terrain riddled with gullies, stone walls, and irrigation ditches that could break an ankle or separate units beyond recovery. The margin for error was zero. A single mistake would expose the entire army to cavalry slaughter at first light. But here is where the limitations of ancient communication technology created chaos that no amount of planning could prevent. Horn signals that worked perfectly during daylight became impossible to coordinate across 2 miles of marching troops in absolute darkness. Units that should have moved in sequence began their withdrawal simultaneously, creating bottlenecks at river crossings where thousands of men pressed forward while their commanders shouted contradictory orders. The carefully planned withdrawal dissolved into a nightmare of confused masses stumbling through the darkness. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the Greek army had fragmented into 3 separate forces, moving in different directions. The center contingents, mostly allied troops from minor cities, had veered too far west and were approaching Thebes, where Persian cavalry patrols waited. The Athenians under Aristides had interpreted their orders differently and were marching north toward the mountain passes, opening a dangerous gap in the withdrawal route. Most catastrophically, the Spartans found themselves completely isolated, separated from their allies, and moving toward Plataea with no knowledge of where the rest of the Greek army had disappeared. Mardonius received reports of the Greek movement before dawn, brought by Theban cavalry scouts who had been monitoring enemy positions throughout the night. The Persian general's reaction was immediate and predictable. This was the moment he had orchestrated through weeks of patient maneuvering. The Greeks were fleeing in panic, their formation discipline shattered, their units scattered across terrain that favored cavalry pursuit. Persian trumpets echoed across the plain as 300,000 men prepared for the hunt that would complete their conquest of Europe. What happened next revealed why Pausanias would be remembered as either the savior of Greece or its destroyer. As Persian cavalry swept across the Asopus River in pursuit of the scattered Greek forces, the Spartan contingent found itself in the exact position that military doctrine said meant certain death: 10,000 heavy infantry, isolated on open ground, facing 50,000 mounted warriors who could strike from all directions while staying beyond spear range. The mathematics were final. Persian cavalry could circle the Spartan phalanx indefinitely, launching arrows until Greek shields became too heavy to lift and exhaustion made resistance meaningless. The psychological moment had arrived that would define the battle's outcome. As dawn broke over the Boeotian plain, Mardonius surveyed a tactical situation that exceeded his most optimistic projections. The Greek army had disintegrated exactly as Persian strategy demanded. The Spartans, supposedly the finest infantry in Greece, stood isolated and apparently panicked near the Temple of Hera outside Plataea. Persian cavalry controlled every approach route. The allied forces were scattered and vulnerable to piecemeal destruction. Here is where legend meets the brutal reality of ancient warfare. Mardonius made the decision that would either crown his career with the greatest victory in Persian history, or mark him as the general who snatched defeat from the jaws of certain triumph. Instead of maintaining the tactical advantages that had brought him to this moment, instead of using his cavalry superiority to destroy the Greeks through patient attrition, the Persian commander chose direct assault. His reasoning was sound. Why prolong the inevitable when overwhelming force could achieve immediate results? The Persian general who had conquered Thrace and burned Athens gave the order that would determine whether Western civilization would survive its infancy. 50,000 elite infantry supported by the finest cavalry in the world would advance against 10,000 isolated Spartans who had nowhere to run and no possibility of reinforcement. The mathematics were so overwhelmingly favorable that Persian officers began composing dispatches announcing victory before the battle had even begun. But, as Mardonius deployed his forces for what should have been a triumphant massacre, neither side could foresee that the Greeks had just achieved something no ancient army had ever accomplished. They had turned apparent disaster into the perfect tactical trap. The withdrawal that looked like panic was about to become the deadliest ambush in military history, proving that sometimes the most brilliant strategies appear indistinguishable from complete failure until the moment they achieve the impossible. The Persian assault began at dawn with a disciplined precision that had conquered half the known world. Mardonius personally led 50,000 elite infantry across the Asopus River, their bronze-tipped spears catching the morning light like a forest of deadly stars. Behind them came the Immortals, Persia's legendary guard, whose ranks were never allowed to fall below 10,000, each warrior wearing scale armor that had been perfected through generations of imperial warfare. The sight should have broken Greek morale instantly. An avalanche of imperial might rolling toward 10,000 isolated Spartans who had nowhere to retreat. But As the Persian phalanx closed to within 300 yards of the Spartan position, something unprecedented began to unfold. Instead of the panicked militia Mardonius expected, the Spartans formed their battle line with mechanical precision that defied their apparently desperate situation. Bronze shields locked together in an unbroken wall 8 men deep, 8-foot spears protruding through the gaps at precisely calculated angles. Each warrior had trained for this moment since age 7, their muscle memory so ingrained that formation fighting required no conscious thought. The collision was beyond human comprehension. 50,000 Persian infantry crashed into 10,000 Spartans like a tsunami hitting a bronze seawall, the impact generating sound waves that could be heard 10 miles away. Persian wicker shields designed for mobility and archery support shattered against Spartan bronze that had been forged specifically for close combat. Spear points, designed to penetrate leather, found themselves useless against armor that weighed 70 pounds per man and had been perfected through centuries of hoplite warfare. Here is where ancient combat reveals its mathematical brutality. Persian infantry, accustomed to fighting behind walls of archers and cavalry, suddenly found themselves in grinding hand-to-hand combat against warriors who had spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this scenario. The physical advantages were overwhelming. Spartan bronze spear points could punch through Persian armor at close range, while Persian weapons, optimized for different tactical roles, proved inadequate against Greek defensive equipment. In the first 20 minutes of contact, 3,000 Persian infantry lay dead or dying, while Spartan casualties numbered fewer than 200. The exchange rate was catastrophic for an empire that had built its reputation on military invincibility. Worse, the Persian formation began to buckle under pressure from warriors who refused to give ground despite facing impossible odds. Units that had conquered Egypt and Babylon found themselves being pushed backward by Greek farmers and potters who fought with the fury of men defending their homeland. Then came the moment that would echo through military history forever. Mardonius, seeing his infantry assault faltering, committed himself personally to the combat. The Persian general who had burned Athens, conquered Thrace, and received the submission of half the Greek world charged directly into the Spartan line, accompanied by his elite bodyguard of 1,000 Persian nobles. His reasoning was tactically sound. Sometimes leadership required personal example to inspire troops whose morale was beginning to crack. The personal duel lasted exactly 17 minutes. Mardonius, mounted on his Nisaean stallion and wearing armor gifted by Xerxes himself, fought his way to within spear range of the Spartan battle line, where warriors who had never retreated in their lives waited with bronze-tipped death. A Spartan, whose name the chroniclers never recorded, thrust his 8-foot spear through a gap in Persian scale armor. The bronze point penetrated Mardonius's eye socket and emerged from the base of his skull. The psychological impact was instantaneous and devastating. Persian troops who had followed Mardonius from India to Greece watched their invincible commander die like any ordinary mortal. His golden armor, no protection against Spartan steel, guided by hands that had trained for war since childhood. The Persian formation, which had advanced with mechanical precision, began to dissolve. As word spread that their general had fallen to barbarian infantry they were supposed to be slaughtering. But the real catastrophe began when Persian morale finally snapped. Elite infantry who had conquered civilizations from Scythia to Ethiopia suddenly found themselves fleeing in panic from Greek farmers armed with bronze spears. The retreat became a rout, then a massacre, as Spartan discipline maintained pursuit, while Persian organization collapsed completely. Units that had never known defeat discovered what happened when imperial confidence met Greek desperation channeled through perfect military training. Within 1 hour of Mardonius's death, the Persian center had disintegrated beyond recovery. 10,000 Spartans had achieved what military historians still consider impossible. They had shattered 50,000 elite Persian infantry through superior tactics, equipment, and the kind of desperate courage that can only be forged by men fighting for everything they hold sacred. The empire that stretched from India to Egypt had just discovered that numbers mean nothing when facing warriors who would rather die than yield a single step of Greek soil. As Persian horns sounded retreat across the Boeotian plain, the mathematical impossibility had become historical reality. The greatest infantry force in Persian history lay scattered across the limestone ground, while Greek warriors who should have been annihilated stood victorious amid the wreckage of imperial ambition. But the real reckoning was just beginning. The collapse of Persian resistance was total and instantaneous. As news of Mardonius's death spread through the Persian ranks, what had been the largest imperial army ever assembled in Europe disintegrated into a panicked mob fleeing toward the Hellespont. The rout revealed the brutal mathematics of ancient warfare when discipline meets chaos. Persian infantry who had conquered Babylon and Sardis threw away their weapons and armor, abandoning equipment worth a king's ransom in their desperate flight from Greek spears that seemed to multiply with every step. Aristides and his 8,000 Athenians arrived at the crucial moment when Persian retreat was becoming systematic massacre. The general who had been separated from the main battle during the chaotic night withdrawal now found himself perfectly positioned to cut off Persian escape routes toward Thebes. His men, fresh and eager for revenge after watching their city burn, fell upon Persian supply trains with the fury of citizens who had lost everything except their desire for retribution. The assault on the Persian fortified camp revealed treasures that stunned even veteran warriors accustomed to the wealth of conquered cities. Mardonius's personal pavilion contained golden furniture that required 20 men to carry silk tapestries from China worth more than entire Greek cities, and silver vessels crafted by the finest artisans in the Persian Empire. The general's private treasury held 2,000 talents of gold, enough to finance the Athenian navy for 5 years, or build 3 Parthenons from foundation to roof. But the human cost of victory told an even more remarkable story. Persian casualties numbered over 200,000 dead, according to Herodotus, though modern historians consider this figure inflated. What remains undisputed is the exchange rate that defied every assumption about ancient combat. Greek losses totaled 1,360 men across the entire coalition, with the Spartans suffering exactly 91 deaths despite bearing the brunt of Persian assault. By any measure of military effectiveness, Plataea represented the most lopsided victory in recorded history. The psychological transformation among the Greeks was immediate and profound. Warriors who had spent a year fleeing Persian advances suddenly understood that their enemy was not invincible. The empire that had conquered from India to Egypt could be defeated by disciplined citizens fighting for their homeland. Persian tactics that had terrified Mediterranean civilizations for generations proved inadequate against Greek bronze and training. Most importantly, the coalition that had seemed impossibly fragile had held together under ultimate pressure. Here is what the treasure captured at Mardonius's camp revealed about Persian imperial psychology. The general had brought his entire household to Greece, including concubines, personal chefs, and furniture sufficient to establish a permanent administrative center. Persian confidence had been so absolute that they had planned not just to conquer Greece, but to colonize it immediately. Maps found in the command tent showed detailed plans for Persian settlements throughout the Peloponnese and administrative districts extending to the Atlantic Ocean. The strategic implications became clear as Greek messengers raced toward every city-state with news that would electrify the Mediterranean world. The Persian Empire had suffered its first major land defeat in 50 years. More importantly, they had lost their entire European expeditionary force, along with the general who embodied Persian military prestige. Xerxes' invasion, which had begun with such overwhelming confidence at Thermopylae, had ended with complete disaster on the plains of Boeotia. Pausanias faced the immediate decision that would define his place in history: pursue the fleeing Persians and risk overextending his forces, or consolidate victory and secure the strategic gains already achieved. The young Spartan regent chose wisdom over glory, ordering his forces to secure the battlefield and divide the spoils according to each city-state's contribution to victory. The decision ensured that the Greek coalition would remain united for the challenges ahead. The distribution of Persian treasure revealed something unprecedented in Greek history: genuine cooperation between traditional rivals. Sparta, which could have claimed the lion's share as the force that broke Persian resistance, insisted on equal distribution among all participants. Athens, despite providing crucial support in the final assault, accepted Spartan leadership without protest. The victory that had seemed impossible had also achieved something equally remarkable. It had taught Greeks that they were stronger united than divided. As evening fell on the battlefield where Western civilization had narrowly avoided extinction, the survivors began to understand what they had accomplished. They had not just defeated a Persian army, they had proven that free citizens, properly trained and led, could overcome any force on Earth when fighting for principles worth dying for. The empire that had seemed destined to rule the world had discovered that some things cannot be conquered, only defended by those who understand their true value. But the deeper significance would only become clear in the decades that followed. Plataea had ensured that democracy, philosophy, and individual freedom would survive to influence human development for millennia. The 10,000 Spartans who had faced impossible odds had saved more than Greece. They had preserved the future itself. If you want to understand how 10,000 Spartans turned apparent chaos into perfect tactical trap and killed 200,000 Persians in one day, subscribe to Medieval Battles immediately, because next week we are revealing the exact night withdrawal tactics that fragmented the Greek army into the deadliest ambush in ancient history, the phalanx combat techniques that shattered Persian confidence, the strategic patience that turned Persian cavalry superiority into fatal overconfidence, and why Spartan discipline proved more lethal than Persian numbers. So smash that subscribe button on Medieval Battles now, because understanding how Pausanias transformed desperate retreat into systematic massacre changes everything you think you know about ancient warfare, and the principles proven on that Boeotian plain still influence modern tactical doctrine taught today at military academies, where training and equipment matter infinitely more than counting soldiers or assembling overwhelming numerical advantages.